Good evening, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for this tablet webinar. Tonight, we'll absolutely be delighted to be joined by Brendan Walsh, the editor of the tablet, Margaret Hebblethwaite, who's a Catholic journalist and feminist writer, and Ed Stourton, who is a presenter of the BBC Radio 4 programme. This evening, we'll be talking about 10 years since sainthood. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Brendan. Many thanks. Good evening, Brendan.
Hello, everybody. Hope you can hear me and see me okay. I can see most of you. It's always slightly alarming when you do these because your faces kind of pop up, and I look for the names and the faces just to see just how intimidating a crowd we've got, and you all look terribly distinguished. So I'm, as Amanda said, thank you, Amanda, I'm Brendan Walsh, and I'm the editor of the tablet, and I'm being joined tonight, as you can see, by two of the most distinguished writers and commentators in the Catholic world. We've got Margaret Hebblethwaite and Ed Stourton. And we're going to be talking about the lives and the influence, the impact they had of two of the greatest figures in the story of the church in the 20th century, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. John the 23rd, who was Pope between 1958 and 1963, and John Paul II, who was Pope between 1978 and his death in 2005. But before we, Margaret and Edward, introduce these two popes, and then they'll go on to do their little comparisons and contrasts, the two of them, and then we'll have a bit of a chat. I'll just introduce Margaret and Edward and Ed. Margaret Hebblethwaite, she's a British journalist, writer, biblical scholar, indefatigable hiker, and of course a regular contributor to the tablet, who I'm sure you all know. She read theology and philosophy at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and studied at the Gregorian University in Rome. In 1974, Margaret married Peter Hebblethwaite, perhaps the leading, perhaps he invented Vaticanology. He was certainly the leading Vaticanologist of his time. And he was the author of two really remarkably, I mean, they set the standard, I think, for papal biographies. He wrote a biography of John the 23rd, and then he wrote a biography of Paul VI. He wrote lots of books, including, there's one that probably most of you know called The Runaway Church, which described the church in the years after Vatican II. From 1991 to 2000, Margaret was assistant editor of the tablet. And then in year 2000, she set off on a remarkable adventure. She became a sort of freelance missionary, making her home in the rural small town of Santa Maria in Paraguay, where she founded a pioneering education fund, which made it possible for students from poor families to receive a tertiary level education. And Margaret, as you probably all know, has written several books, including Motherhood and God, particularly brilliant book, and of course the definitive travel guide to Paraguay. Now, Ed Stourton is a journalist, writer and broadcaster. He presents the weekly religious affairs programme Sunday. He's also written and presented many television and radio documentaries for the BBC on politics, foreign affairs and religion. Ed is the son of expat parents in colonial Nigeria. He was sent to Britain to be educated by Benedictine monks at Ampleforth. He made his name as a foreign correspondent. He was a witness when the Soviet flag was lowered over Red Square for the last time, when Checkpoint Charlie was cleared, and when Nelson Mandela was released. After reporting from war zones, he returned home to join the infighting on BBC Radio 4's Today programme. He describes this remarkable journey in a terrific memoir that came out last year called Confessions, which his former Today colleague John Humphreys describes as a searingly honest insight into the life of one of our great journalists, and hugely entertaining too. Now, in April 2006, a year after the death of John Paul II, Ed published a biography of John Paul II, Man of History. And in 2016, he presented a panorama investigation, which caused a bit of a stir into John Paul II's intense, emotional, and chaste relationship with a married Polish woman. And Ed is a trustee of the tablet. Now, what we're going to do now is Margaret and Ed in turn, I think I've got that the right way around, will each introduce these two popes, and then I'll go back to them both again, and they'll have another go at comparing and contrasting them. So first, Margaret, you're going to tell us something about John the 23rd. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Brendan. The only tiny nuance is I'd prefer to be called a pilgrim rather than a hiker. You walk with pilgrimage intent. Right. Well, tell you about John the 23rd, Angelo Roncalli, as he was born. He came from a very poor family, north of Italy, so poor that he said they never had bread on the table. They only had polenta, and they only had a slice of cake at Easter and at Christmas. But a devout family, and he then went to seminary and was ordained in due course. Rather interesting thing about him is he really is and was and always was a pastor. That was his great gift, was pastoral work, relating to people in a pastoral way. And yet he wasn't a parish priest. His first job was to be a secretary to a bishop in Bergamo. And then he got sent off to Bulgaria as an apostolic visitor. And then he got sent to Istanbul. So it was decades away from Rome, being a diplomat, not a pastor. Or, I'm sure he was a pastor in the process of that, but it wasn't like in the forefront of his job description. And then a nuncio to France, Vatican observer to UNESCO. And then when he got back to Italy, it was to be Patriarch of Venice. So it went straight up to being an archbishop at that stage. And he was on 3 Vatican congregations. But that might seem a rather sort of typical CV for a future pope, but he didn't actually want to be a cardinal. And he said, he didn't really want to go. And he thought initially he would be going to Rome rather than Venice, and he didn't want to. He said, I'm happy in France. And he said, all those meetings in Rome, it's not what I'm good at. I'm a pastor, really. And anyway, then he got elected when Pius XII eventually died. And in the thoughts of many of the cardinals was to appoint a caretaker pope. They'd had a long time with Pius XII, 19 years, and Roncalli was 76, nearly 77 when he was elected. So the idea was nothing much would happen, but you'd have a few years grace. Well, they could sort of look around and make sure that it wasn't a progressive who got in. And then he did this amazing thing of calling a council, which most people thought was a mistake, including Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, who said, this holy old boy doesn't realize what a hornet's nest he's going to stir up. But then Montini became, as the council developed, he became a very strong advocate of it, and very much a colleague. He was already a colleague of Roncalli, but even more so, and then became the next pope on the specific agenda of carrying forward the Concilia program. And it's very intriguing. The question was John a progressive or conservative? I mean, we might all assume he was a progressive because so many progressive things happened when he was Pope, but that's not really so. He wanted the council because he wanted to sort of let the Holy Spirit rip through the church. He trusted very much, not only in the Holy Spirit, but in other people. And he didn't have an agenda for it. Now, Pius XII had considered having a council, but Pius XII's idea was a council to correct errors and to sort of, put people on the right track, which Pius XII, knew. Then he realized he didn't need a council to do that since he could do it by himself anyway. And that's completely the opposite to John the 23rd, who wanted a council because he didn't really know what track the church should be on, except that you must trust people, you must be optimistic. It's good if people speak their minds. And he very much wanted an aggiornamento. Interestingly, became sort of a slogan word for him, but he wasn't the person who first used it. It was initially used in the context of updating canon law. But he's a great believer that you would have an aggiornamento not by condemning errors. He said, errors will vanish as the mist before the sun. What you need to do is trust and listen to people. And you could see little hints of this before he became Pope. Like, it's a very nice quote from the synod that he held in Venice, which I may add is not a synod in Pope Francis's idea that everyone expressed their opinion. There was no sort of free opinion, no democracy. It was just talks. But Roncalli, in his talk, said, authoritarianism stifles life and leads to a rigid external discipline and to complicated, harmful over-organization. It represses legitimate initiatives, is unable to listen, confuses harshness with firmness, inflexibility with dignity. And then he said, paternalism is also a caricature of paternity. It keeps people immature in order to maintain its own superior position. So that was very much the kind of Pope he was. It's very interesting, that kind of language and trust that he had. He was very charming, very affable, and the kind of thing he did was, to make people feel relaxed in his presence. He would tell them how his brother had been caught poaching. Now, the curial cardinals didn't like this kind of talk at all. They were forever slightly editing things he said so as to cut out things that could be misconstrued or cause problems. And so another talent that he had, he was to recognize good people. So, I mean, it's very interesting, the conservative tendencies of Roncalli were immediately before the council, he called a synod in Rome. And this was just perfectly dreadful. The synod in Rome decided that priests should wear their cassocks, have tonsures, should not go to the opera, should only go in cars if it was necessary, and never alone with a woman. And then even in his early years as Pope, he published 4 very conservative encyclicals. And when it came to the council, the Curia drew up all the schemata. These were the preparatory documents. which they wanted then sort of to be approved by acclamation. And John said, no, 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 people have got to talk about them, but don't worry, because he said, I think the schemata will then be accepted unanimously. Well, he couldn't have been more wrong about that. But so he really didn't know what was coming. But that didn't mean say he was disappointed by what was coming, because it wasn't that he had his own agenda. He wanted the people to make the agenda. He wanted to listen to people. And listening to people, he was able to recognize good people. And then, you know, he began to trust them more in the context of the council. So you had, for example, Cardinal Beyer, who he then appointed to forward the cause of ecumenism, and that became very influential. And Cardinal Sunens, who then became a sort of confidant of John during the council. And he was the person who said, don't make the council all ad intra, all about internal affairs. It's got to be ad extra as well. That's to say, speaking to the world. And then Schillebeeckx also was coming up at this stage. When he read the schemata, he wrote 47 blistering pages, devastating everything that it was saying this whole lot's got to be junked out, which the council did. It then junked out all the schemata. And very interestingly, Kung also was beginning at this time and came up with 7 points. This is in the pre-conciliar discussions that John was inviting. And they all went into the conciliar documents. Kung said, we've got to recognize the Reformation as a religious event. We've got to promote the use of the Bible. We've got to have the liturgy in the vernacular. We've got to have a sense of the universal priesthood, not just the clericalism of the ordained. We have to have a dialogue with other cultures. We have to reform the Curia, and we have to abolish the index of forbidden books. So that was John as a pastor. He did amazing things towards Khrushchev, and you know, who's then heading the USSR. I'm sure we'll talk about that shortly. And was an absolute phenomenon in his less than 5 years as Pope. The classic phrase is he opens the windows of the Vatican and lets the wind of the Holy Spirit blow through.
That's wonderful, Margaret. Thanks so much. It's a perfect short beginner's guide to John the 23rd. And now with his Ladybird guide to Pope John Paul II, we'll have Ed Stourton.
Well, Brendan, in that incredibly, and in fact, embarrassingly generous introduction, you reminded me of the hubris of writing a papal biography in the shadow of Peter Hebblethwaite's absolutely sort of magnificent volumes. But I did it. I began it in the early years of the 2000s and finished it just after his death. And one of the reasons for doing it was a sense I had even back then that the old John Paul, this rather unsympathetic, dictatorial, intolerant, slightly cold figure, the Pope in Winter, I think one of his biographers called him, that there was a real danger that John Paul would obscure and make us forget John Paul the Great, who I think is, you can really give him that name, of the early years of his pontificate. He was elected when I was in my second year at university, and my early years in journalism coincided with those great visits to Poland, his visits to this country, the assassination attempt against him, and that magnificent act of forgiveness when he went to see his would-be assassin in prison, and of course the early battles in liberation theology. And I got to do a few more of those stories than I would normally have done being quite junior, because ITN, who I worked for then, were a bit short on people who understood the Catholic Church. And it was an incredibly exciting period. Just the energy of the man after those years of quietude, I think is perhaps the word, in the last days of Paul VI was just extraordinarily exciting. And it was one of those periods of my life when I felt proud to be Catholic, and that certainly hasn't been true of my whole life. I have a slightly odd psychological twitch which some of you may share, which is I find it very difficult to think of myself as anything other than a 20th century person. You made the point, Brendan, that I was born in the colonies. I was born within sort of almost touching distance of the Second World War, a decade or so afterwards. And I find it very odd to be in the third decade of the 21st century. And I think anybody of my generation, anybody who sort of feels a bit like that, is bound to think of John Paul in the context of his contribution to the unraveling of that seemingly endless series of violence and war which marked that troubled century. And I think I will do a little bit of a CV here. I think one of the reasons he was able to do that was because he had lived the century in a way that very few big leaders did. He'd lived it at his worst. So his father was a junior officer, and I still don't get my head around this, in the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Army, which means the man who took the church in the 21st century had a mind formed in a way with lots of the ideas of the 19th century. He grew up in that, what we now know to be that brief frame of freedom for Poland between the two world wars. And he soaked himself in the great Polish romantic poets and dramatists, who, of course, had a very, very high concept of Poland's destiny and of Polish nationhood. And I don't want to call him a nationalist because that word has all sorts of negative connotations, but I think during that period, he imbued a very powerful sense of what Poland was about and about the relationship between the nation and the Catholic Church. He then, of course, had to endure one of the worst periods of that terrible century in one of the worst places to be then. Krakow during the Nazi occupation was the heart of darkness. You had Auschwitz just down the road. You had Hans Frank sitting in Wawel Castle, administering a regime dedicated to wiping out, really, foolishness, clamping down on the church, ruling with great cruelty. And I think he learned 3 lessons during that period, which we'll see again when we come to talk about what he achieved later in this discussion as Pope. I think the first was about the nature of evil and its randomness, because that was a period when you really could be picked up off the street and sent to a camp or shot. You could lose your life because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it's maybe slightly fanciful, but I think his love of order in an institution and predictability, to some extent, goes back to that searing experience. The other thing I think he learned was a faith in the idea of the church as a sanctuary. As many of you know, he was taken into a secret seminary in the last stages of the war, which was run from the Cardinal Archbishop's palace with a group of other young men, about a dozen of them, and they were hidden from the Nazis, and they began their formation for the priesthood in those very, very unusual circumstances. And again, I think the idea of a church as a place of sanctuary is something that you see right through, certainly during his time as a bishop in Poland, but really right through his life. And finally, I think he learned a lesson about leadership. The Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, who formed this secret seminary and who looked after them, was a man called Sapieha, known generally as Prince Sapieha, because he was a prince by birth and a prince of the church at the same time. And he was a sort of wonderful example of a particular style of leadership of that period. He was aristocratic, autocratic, deeply traditional in his understanding of the Catholic Church and of the hierarchy and of ideas like the importance of obedience, but also absolutely iron-willed and fearless in his resistance insofar as it was possible to put resistance up to the Nazi occupation. And again, I can't help feeling that Karol Wojtyła, this young man who'd lost his, all his family by this stage, who'd been brought into the Archbishop's palace and looked after, saw that as a kind of model, and that's one he followed later. He then, of course, confronts the other sort of great evil of the 20th century, which was decades living in an embattled church, threatened all the time by communism. And again, I think you can see the lessons he took from that. Firstly, a sense that, and this is a contrast, we're talking about contrast to one I know, but with John Paul, with John XXIII, a sense that the church is very often at war with the society around it, but also a confidence that the church can win, because it couldn't be suppressed in Poland, try as the communist authorities might. And I think that gave him a sort of confidence in the power of the institution, enormous confidence, which again is a lesson he learned for his later life. So I'm not going to do the whole of the rest of the CV, because it'll come out in our discussion about the contrast. And his papacy was the second longest pontificate, I think, apart from, if we discount St. Peter, but after Pio Nono. But just leave you with the thought that when you look at him as Pope, both as the glory days in the early 80s and in the slightly frostier days in his last years, those lessons from his early life you can see being reflected.
Thanks so much, Ed. You've both given us, Pilgrim Margaret and Pilgrim Ed, have given us two lovely vignettes of these two figures. Now, I'm going to go back to Margaret now and ask Margaret, you've heard Ed, and I know you've read and know all about John Paul II. How would you compare and contrast Pope John the 23rd with Pope John Paul II? We have some very simplistic, stereotypical, sometimes, ways of describing one as the great progressive opener up, and the other as the Pope of the restoration, of turning back the clock. And I know both of you have got a much more textured story to tell than that. So first, Margaret, when you look at these two figures together, what do you see as where they're in alignment, and what do you think the contrasts are between them?
Well, textured perhaps, but I think that's basically correct, that John was the great opener up, and John Paul was the great closer down. And in that sense, they were totally opposed to each other. Now, when I say the great closer down, I have to modify that by saying with regard to the Catholic Church, because as far as his relations went outside of the church, he was a great opener up as well. And John Paul the Great, it's not a term I would use myself. I fully accept it's an appropriate term, because he was monumental. He was, he reminds me of Julius Caesar, in the words of Cassius, "Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his great, under his great legs, and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves." He was a superstar. There's no doubt that he was a superstar. And but then in another way, John was. They were both extremely good with crowds, but in totally different ways. John was very much, I'll come down on your level, I'll chat to you like your grandfather, tell me, there's a lovely thing when he met Khrushchev's daughter and son-in-law, which it was a terribly controversial meeting. The Curia, like anything, didn't want it to happen. So he managed to get it to happen rather surreptitiously by having them invited to a press conference, because the son-in-law was a journalist. And then afterwards they sort of slipped off and had a chat together. And John said, it's beautiful. Tell me the names of your children. I know them already. But when a mother says the names of the children, it just has a special feel to it. So she told him the names. Oh, it's wonderful. And you know, Ivan, your son Ivan, do you know that's the same name as John? And that's the name I took. And when you get home, please give them all a special hug from me. And an extra big hug for Ivan. The others won't mind. Now, you couldn't in a million years imagine John Paul II talking like that. I mean, he kissed the babies, yes, he kissed one of my babies, yes, but totally different style. As we were living in Rome 2 years during his pontificate, we went there with that sense of excitement that Ed describes. This is a very exciting papacy. And my poor husband got more and more depressed and deflated, you know, as condemnation came out after condemnation, and contraception got walloped again and again. And it wasn't what we were expecting. You know, then we had the Leonardo Boff hauled up over the coals and skillibecks, and oh dear. Anyway, that's not to deny that other good things were happening, but John Paul came out with these reams and reams. He wrote at great length, and it was all very boring. And Peter's job was to go into the press office every day and pick up these lengthy texts and wade through them. And then an extraordinary thing happened. I mean, I remember very intently, if I could tell a little anecdote, I was on pilgrimage to Assisi. And as I passed the friar to go into the basilica, he called me back and he said, "Signora, are you a Catholic?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "The Pope has just been shot." And I said, "Oh my God, is he going to die?" And he said, "We don't know. He's being operated on now." And then I was back in Rome the next day. And what I remember so intensely was, it was in the Easter season. So it was the Regina Caeli that the Pope would normally say from the window of his quarters of the Vatican. But in this case, he said it from his bed in the hospital. And it was absolutely riveting. And I looked up, you know, in preparation for this webinar, his words, because they were so moving. We listened to it again and again. And he said, "Prego, per il fratello che mi ha colpito, al quale ho sinceramente perdonato." There was no possibility of doubt that that was genuine. "I pray for the brother who struck me down, who I have sincerely forgiven." He had sincerely forgiven him, you know, immediately, even before that wonderful meeting, secret talk with him for, I think it was for 20 minutes. And Peter said, you know, in those few words, because poor man was too ill and too much in pain to speak his usual long time. It was a very short address. Those few words were worth everything else he'd ever said up to that point. And that witness of forgiveness, you know, for that alone, he deserves to be canonized. And you know, he was a holy man. I have no doubt of that. A man of great faith, but he had great faults in his holiness. His holiness was the opposite kind of holiness from John the 23rd. It wasn't the one of trusting in other people. It was, at least not those within the church. And this is what I can't understand. He did great things on the interfaith dialogue, which I didn't have a moment to speak about. That was a tremendous step forward. I mean, up till now, you know, these were pagans who believed in false gods or whatever. He initiated these meetings where they would pray, and the cura wouldn't let him pray actually with them in the same room. So they had to pray in different buildings, but at the same time and for the same purpose. That was really groundbreaking. So I find it a puzzle. The more I look back at the good things he did, the more I cannot understand why he was so repressive within the church and made us all suffer so much. And it went on and on. And I mean, just to give an example, the article which Brendan was kind enough to publish recently on women being at the Last Supper, I'm not sure that the tablet could have dared publish that during the pontificate of JP2, because although the tablet is independent, they would have had a very hard rap across the knuckles. And, you know, that was the atmosphere, that all the sort of fizz that came up to us as Catholic. I mean, I don't know, I felt proud to be a Catholic after the council, because being a Catholic was to suddenly feel free to experiment and, you know, to explore your faith. And suddenly you couldn't explore it. You had to be very careful what you said. And why was he like that? I mean, he saw everything through these sort of spectacles that could see nothing other than that communism was atheism, was evil, and that anyone in the church who showed anything that could be interpreted as a Marxist sympathy had to be reproached. That priests had to wear the Roman collar, that nuns had to wear their habit, and it was completely the opposite from John the 23rd in that sense. And yet they both, this is extraordinary fact, they both had tremendous influence on world politics. But John had influence on world politics by being friendly towards communists against immense opposition from within his own church and his own curia. Whereas John Paul had immense influence on politics by being opposed to communism. But he did all these trips around the world as a globe-trotting superstar. And actually, his press secretary, Navarro Valls, very interesting, said where he went, dictatorships fell in not just Poland, but Chile. He went to Chile, spoke with Pinochet, and there he went in 87. In 1990, Pinochet stepped aside. He went to the Philippines in 1981. In 1986, Marcos went. He went even to my dear country of Paraguay in 1988. And in the very beginning of 1989, Stroessner was deposed. So in an extraordinary way, he had a very positive influence on world politics, but from the completely opposite standpoint from John the 23rd. And now I must let Ed say something.
Thanks
Okay,
so much, Margaret.
I'll just give you three examples, two which I think show the contrast and emphasize contrast which Margaret's talked about, one which perhaps suggests it's not quite as simple as that. And the first may also, it's certainly not going to explain your puzzlement, Margaret, about the kind of extraordinary paradoxes of John Paul, but it may illuminate them a little bit. Let's talk about John Paul and the council, because although he's often seen as somebody who tried to dismantle the advances of the council, he saw it as an incredibly important event. And many of the intellectual arguments that went into, for example, Gaudium et Spes, Hope and Joy, and the idea of the church's relationship with society, and the document on religious freedom, those fed into his struggle in Poland and were a sort of source of intellectual sustenance. And I think you could argue that he would never have been what he was if the council hadn't happened. But there is no doubt that he and his fellow Polish bishops approached it in a very different way. You talked about it as being an event which encouraged debate. And a lot of journalists who I've spoken to who actually attended it remember the thrill of the church, as they put it, behaving like a democracy. I mean, you had the bishops in St. Peter's in these two great ranks of seats on either side, almost like a giant House of Commons. You had bishops being taken out to lunch by journalists and spinning stories, documents being leaked over a discreet cup of coffee not far from the Vatican, all that sort of stuff. And to the watching world, that was just fantastic and was a kind of symbol of the way that John was opening up the church. The Polish bishops, not just Wojtyła, but Wyszynski, who was the primate at the time, and he wrote about this in his diaries, were absolutely horrified because they came from a persecuted church. The communist authorities were constantly trying to open up division between the hierarchy, between priests and bishops, recruiting a priest here who could sow dissent in the ranks. So they were believers in absolutely rigid discipline. If you showed dissent, you let the enemy in. You gave the communist authorities a victory. So that explains, I think, that that sort of completely different view of the world that informs some of the paradoxes that we see in John Paul. The second thing I want to pick up on your use of the word, your quote, in fact, from John the 23rd about authoritarianism. There are two big factors, I think, in distinguishing the nature of the impact these two popes have. One is obviously the time they were in office. So, as you said, John died while his council was still going. John Paul seemed to go on forever and had ample time to put his stamp, his personal stamp, on the church. John, I think, from what you say, was not somebody who had great ambition to do that. He wanted to open up the church, but he didn't want to make it look like the John the 23rd church. Whereas John Paul II, I think, absolutely did want the church to look like the John Paul II church. And not just when he was there, but in perpetuity. And an illustration of that is what he did about women priests. The document Ordinatio Sacerdotales, which came out, I think, in 1994, which reiterated the traditional objection to women priests, but also said that this matter could not be discussed. And Cardinal Ratzinger, as he then was, issued a clarification saying this is to be held as part of the deposit of the faith now and forever by everyone. So there's that real ambition to put your mark on the church and form it, and I think that's a big divide between them. I'm take very slight issue with what you said about the two popes and the communist world, because I think they both shared a vision of Europe, which was similar. John Paul had this idea of Europe being a continent with two lungs, and said that during the communist years, only one lung was really breathing. And I think that's what was part of what motivated his desire to end communism, not just to rescue the church, but to reunite Europe. And I think John was, trying to do something similar with his Ostpolitik, as it was called. And I think, today it's perhaps worth saying what an important part of the Catholic vision that was, because we live in a world of the war in Ukraine, where the division of Europe is so sort of stark, and where Western Europe is whole in a way that it wasn't then. And Poland, let's face it, particularly now that we've left the European Union, is one of the big powers in Western Europe. So I think they sort of shared something similar in that regard. But of course, as you say, I mean, the first two examples I give do speak to your point that they were very, very different figures in lots of ways.
Thanks, Ed. Just to remind people, if anybody has any questions to put to either Margaret or Ed, or to both of them, if you just key them in under that little symbol at the bottom row where you can see the word chat, and you can feed in any questions there, and I'll put them to Ed and Margaret. And just to remind people again that tonight's webinar is sponsored by the Notre Dame University of Australia, who have partnered with the tablet on a lot of initiatives over the last year. They're a great partner of ours, and it's also a really innovative education establishment that's doing a lot of very interesting things. So I'm just wondering what you think, a question that a lot of people have asked, which is, you've given us a sense of the holiness and greatness even of these two men, these two popes. Do you have any reservations, either of you, about the way in which it seems these days that if you're a pope, it's almost like you're a former minister of the government, you get put up to the House of Lords, that within 5 to 10 years of you dying, there's a process of canonisation. It's become a bit routine. And that's something quite new, I think, in the church over the last few hundred years, that I think it was Pius V was canonised about 15 or 1600, and there was a long pause before Pius X, I think, was canonised in the 50s, but that took a lot of time, a lot of effort, whereas now it almost feels as if you're not canonised, there's almost a shadow over you if you're a pope. Do you feel any discomfort about, well, first, whether they should have been canonised or whether it happened too quickly? What do either of you think about that?
Well, I do.
Go for it, Margaret. Go for it. Go for it.
All right. I do feel discomfort about this, and I think the blame can be laid fairly and squarely on John Paul II for this, because what was happening before was that Paul VI was cleaning up the list of the saints. It's taking people off the list and reducing the number. Particularly people who were legendary, like St. George. And John Paul II put that into absolutely direct reverse. He beatified and canonized more people in his pontificate than had been done in total in the previous 5 centuries. And his idea was to have a great army of saints. This is an army against the communist hordes, if you like. And I think I'm right in saying that it was John Paul who removed 2 sort of checks on having an excessive number of canonizations. One was the 50-year rule, that you'd wait 50 years, and if there was still a cult of the person 50 years later, then you could begin to consider them for canonization. And the other was the devil's advocate. It was someone specifically asked to find reasons why someone should not be canonized. Now, I think those were both innovations of JP2, right. And it's resulted in this mass of saints and this awful situation, that it'd be an insult to your predecessor if you didn't canonize him.
I completely agree. I think it's a bonkers idea, and partly, I mean, it is the secular comparison that makes the point. I mean, in Downing Street, for example, there's that wall up by the staircase going up to the flat, which has photographs of all prime ministers on it, and the question, arises: do you put Liz Truss there too? We have the same thing at the BBC when, I don't know whether you remember this, a few years back, when a man called Entwistle was made Director General, and things went horribly wrong about a Newsnight investigation. And he lasted for about a month. Now, the tradition has always been that Director Generals have their portrait painted and are placed in the council chamber in Broadcasting House. I'm afraid George does not have that. Which is all, I suppose, a bit of fun when it's secular politics and business, but gets a bit difficult if it's a pope, doesn't it? I mean, if you have a really disastrous one, let's hope we don't, or a very, very short-lived one, do they get the do they get raised to the altars? I don't know. It just feels, it feels routine. It diminishes the value of canonization, I think. You know, I mean, for example, two canonizations that we've endlessly done on the Sunday program were Cardinal Newman and Oscar Oscar. Gosh, I forgot his surname. In El Salvador, Romero, of course, Romero, and those two lives are so rich and so full of interest that as the process of canonization advanced, we had such fascinating discussions about who they were and whether or not they deserve sainthood and so forth. It felt nothing like a rubber stamp. It felt like a very rich process, and one that would give rise to real sort of thought and interest and so forth to Catholics everywhere. And I think just, you know, saying you're Pope, you're a saint diminishes that. So yeah, I do think that. I don't know what Francis's record. Brendan might know this. I mean, what's his in terms of numbers? Is he keeping up with JP2, or is he more of a John the 23rd man?
I think he's more of a, even more keen to, it would seem, to raise people to the altars than John Paul II. I mean, he's responsible, of course, for canonizing 10 years ago these two predecessors. And that just seems slightly, again, a bit uncomfortable. You know, what is he setting a, not that I'm sure he's too fussed about it. One thing, I was wondering about the two of you, I'm looking at their pictures, the photographs, the portraits of Roncalli and Wojtyła. And they both have a kind of, how would you describe it? I mean, they both look like people who might enjoy a good lunch, perhaps a beer for lunch. They've got a certain, I wouldn't say a peasant cunning or that kind of face. And I contrast them a bit with, say, Paul VI and Benedict, who kind of in between them, who seem more scholastic, scholarly, Hamlet-type figures. And you get these two more robust country, all very clever people, but a sense of people with sharper elbows, bigger, physically bigger people, and both of them changed things. They stirred things up. They left the church different to what they found it. Whereas in between, maybe Paul, Benedict, you got people who steadied the ship more. There was the stirrer kind of pope, again in very different ways, but that in common. And then you had the, let's just calm things down, more kind of academic sort of book-lined rooms in between the people who had lunch and went for a walk in the afternoon type of pope. And that's one thing I thought was that they might have perhaps had a bit in common. I think the anxiety thing.
I wonder,
what do you think, Ed?
Well, I was just going to say, I'm not sure. I kind of buy that argument, but it doesn't quite fit because John Paul, he did like a good lunch, but that wasn't really his physicality. His physicality was somebody of enormous energy.
Yeah.
He loved skiing. That was his great passion. He played football as a young man.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And he, you know, he did have enormous pretensions to be an intellectual. You know, how good his stuff was is another matter. But certainly, you mentioned the program I did about his relationship with Anna Teresa Tymieniewska, and that was a relationship that grew out of their joint passion for a particular form of philosophy. So he saw it, and as Margaret said, he wrote endlessly and quite often completely incomprehensibly. Wrote lots of poetry. Do you know what I mean? I think it's a lovely, but I think what you say about, I mean, in his case, confidence is incredibly important, and it's partly a personal trait. But I do think it goes back to his experience as a bishop and priest standing out against communism, because you know, look at the situation externally, and you might have thought the church would just crumble, and it didn't. It created a space for himself, and I think that gave him immense confidence, not just in himself, but in the church.
Yes,
So,
I
Margaret,
would definitely call John Paul an intellectual.
yeah,
He was a very, very intelligent man. Very intelligent men sometimes do write stuff that's rather hard to understand. And yeah, John the 23rd was very fat. He was, what was he, 14 stone, I think I worked out. Yeah, 205 pounds. So I looked that up. That's 14 stone. And the physicality, as Ed said, of John Paul, he's the one who had a swimming pool built for him at Castle
yes,
Gandolfo, skiing and so on.
yeah,
But there was one thing I wanted to come back on Ed, you know, that experience at the council. The thing was, yeah, the council was terribly important to John Paul, but he saw it as completely the opposite from the way anyone else saw it, or the way we in the West saw it. We saw it, as you say, you know, leaking documents and opening things up. And there were two little sort of catchphrases that those of us who lived in the post-conciliar period used. Triumphalism was bad, and we didn't want a fortress church. Yeah. And John Paul wanted a fortress church, and he wanted triumphalism. So he saw the council as a great moment of the church standing against the world. So it's the opposite interpretation.
Ed.
Well, it is and it isn't. And again, I go back to the communist experience. Yeah. In the debates on Gaudium et Spes, which, sorry, I know we're running out of time, so I won't go too deep into theology, but in which he played a great part. The idea of the church at the centre of society was something everyone agreed on. And as you say, in the Western church, and to most of us, that meant the church being at ease with society and not being a fortress.
Yeah.
For him, it meant a reassertion of the fact that the church in Poland should be at the heart of society, despite communism's best efforts to push it to the margins. So it was a reinforcing kind of idea behind the fortress for him because of the different circumstances.
Very good. Now, I have got a few questions. They've all come in a bit late. One thing I think Harold Moseley has reminded us of, and of course he's right, is that one of the great changes, wonderful things, not perfect, but a marvellous change of direction of the last, since the council, has been the relationship between the church and the Jewish people. And John, I think I remember him going to a synagogue, and then John Paul II, out of his particular historic experience. I think both of them, if you were looking for reasons why they are in heaven, perhaps that's something that we should remind ourselves of. I don't know if either of you want to say anything about that, but the way they led or showed us how the relationship between the church and the Jews had to shift in that period. That's one of the great shifts, I think, over the last 50 or 60 years, that they were fundamental.
I mean, they both agreed on, I think.
They both agreed on that. Something they both
yeah. Both agreed, but I have in my notes that it was John Paul who made the first official papal visit to a synagogue when he visited the Great Synagogue of Rome in 1986. So one up on John Paul for that. John the 23rd.
Are you sure? Did John not go to a synagogue? He certainly met Jewish people, didn't he? And said, "I am your brother
Joseph."
That was it, wasn't it? I'm your brother Joseph. That was wonderful, touching.
Oh, he would have loved them. Yeah, and he did love them. According to my notes, he didn't go to a synagogue.
Okay,
but you and I must have a look at that, Brendan, and see if I've missed something.
Good. Now we've got 1 minute left, and there are a couple of people who asked some very interesting questions. They came in a bit late, and I apologise for not putting those questions to Ed and Margaret. But you've given us a really amazing, fantastic evening. I've enjoyed it so much, and I can see from the faces that I can see how much people have found this so absorbing and fascinating. So thank you very, very much indeed. I really appreciate it. Now we're going to pass back to back at headquarters, back to Amanda.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a really good conversation. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all your questions, but what I will do is I'll take the questions and I'll pass them on to the speakers, and maybe they can answer them and I can just email you back. We hate to miss any questions in these webinars, but we do like to finish on time. So as we're at 7 o'clock, I'm not going to do my usual run through thing, but I will say, please do tune in on Tuesday. We have a webinar coming up on Tuesday called Beyond Business, Upholding Dignity in Catholic Universities. It is a Notre Dame sponsored event as well. So thank you very much for Notre Dame for sponsoring this. Thank you to Margaret and to Ed and to Brendan for giving us such a wonderful overview on this particular topic. I'd just like to say on behalf of myself and the Tablet team, many thanks for supporting our webinars, and we all wish you the rest of a lovely evening. Thank you so much and good night.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Thanks, Ed.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Margaret.